In this lecture, we would be discussing the impact of globalization on human rights. At the beginning of lecture, what needs to be emphasized is that the process of globalization is not impacting in a similar manner on all aspects, in the sense that the impact of globalization varies from one situation to the other and one context to the other. So, this variation of the impact of the globalization can be evidently witnessed in the context of human rights. The discussion is going to be broadly divided into 4 components. The first part of the discussion would be focusing on the general framework of human rights at the international level more specifically, but also in certain respects with its similarities in the domestic context. The second part deals with the interaction between the process of globalization and the human rights framework. The third component specifically focuses on the question of development and human rights in the era of globalization. The fourth component focuses on the movement of the people and their right in the process of globalization, in the sense that how the process of globalization is impacting the movement of people, especially across the borders, that is from one country to the other. So, that is the general introduction with regard to the lecture. Going into the first component of the lecture, that is the general framework of human rights understanding. The current understanding of human rights at the international level, more or less most of the domestic systems do follow this model, is that the individual is the center to the understanding of human rights, which means that most of the human rights framework that is part of the international human rights treaties and also in terms of the customary international law, the emphasis is more on individual's rights and his or her relationship with his or her own state. So, therefore, the understanding of human rights is primarily centered around the individual as the center of the understanding of human rights. There are certain collective rights which are part of the human rights framework, but the essential premise on which the human rights framework is based is that the individual is centered to the understanding of human rights. That is a one important feature of the international human rights law as well as some of the human rights framework of domestic systems. The second component is that there is a certain element of hierarchies placed within the human rights understanding. This hierarchy more evident at the international level. Now, this hierarchy is argued in the form of a division between civil and political rights and economic, social and cultural rights. In its inception itself, international humanitarian law witnessed the division among states and individuals about the understanding of the human rights and about the understanding of civil and political rights and economic, social and cultural rights. So, it is also divided based on certain political and economic factors. Civil and political rights were given importance by most of the Western liberal democratic systems, and economic, social and cultural rights were given importance by the erstwhile Soviet Union and its allies. So, it was more in terms of the politically divided opinion about what political and economic system should be followed, based on which the rights understanding also varied. As a result of this division among states, 2 international treaties emerged, that is Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So, it is arguably seen as that civil and political rights are given certain amount of primacy in certain contexts over economic, social and cultural rights. So, that is one feature which in fact comes into play when we discuss international human rights framework. The second other component of this hierarchy issue is that the universalist view and relativist view. So, there is an argument that all the human rights are universal in nature, applicable in every context. The other argument is that the rights understanding should be relativist in nature, means that a single understanding of human rights cannot be made applicable to all the context across the geographical regions. So, there is no finality to this debate, but what needs to be emphasized is that the current understanding of international humanitarian law essentially favors the universalist view of human rights framework. So, that is another component where you come across a division in terms of understanding of what constitutes human rights. The third general feature of the existing human rights understanding is that there is an emphasis on legal and institutional framework with regard to how the human rights operate on the ground, in the sense that for the current understanding of international human rights law is that legal and institutional framework play a significant role in it, which means that most of the international human rights framework is built in such a way that they are claimed as legal rights which can be realized through the institutional framework. Whenever there is an allegation of violation of human rights, there is an institutional structure which comes into play to remedy the violations of human rights. So, that is a third general feature of human rights. The fourth general feature of the human rights framework is that, which is very important feature, is that for the understanding of human rights at the international level as well as most of the domestic systems, is that state is centered to the understanding of human rights, means there is a state centrality in the framework of in the demands that are made in the name of rights, which means that if the rights are violated, primarily human rights are understood as a relation between the state and the individual. So, therefore, the consequence of this is that it is the states which violate individuals' rights, or it is the individual's rights violations which need to be remedied by the state. So, it is mostly the remedial framework comes from the state, not from the private individual. In fact, this is where it is extremely important to understand the non-state actors' relationship to the understanding of human rights, because the current framework of rights is made or built in such a way that devoid of state, it is very difficult to understand the current legal and institutional framework of human rights, because the rights violations are assumed to be committed by the state, and it is the state machinery and the state system which needs to remedy the human rights framework. So, these are the four broad general features which are evident in the existing international human rights framework.